What's up everyone and welcome back to the World History Channel. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button today. Let's get started. What it was like to live on the Oregon Trail. The Oregon Trail was extremely dangerous and extremely boring to live on. Pioneers had to exercise extreme caution and a lot of bravado to cross the 2,170-mile stretch of land starting in Missouri and ending in Oregon. Accidents and disease were just waiting around the corner, but a majority of the trip was just spent trudging along next to the wagon. To say daily life on the Oregon Trail was difficult is a vast understatement. It was hard work and required uprooting your entire family and deciding to venture west for new opportunities, but that didn't stop thousands of people from emigrating and making the long journey. So what was daily life like on the Oregon Trail? It was dirty and cramped, but there also was a prevailing sense of enthusiasm and an adventurous spirit. Even though these pioneers were aware of the dangers, they decided to confront them head-on as they traveled into uncharted territory. Many risked their lives because the West offered a chance for a better one, although the majority of those who traveled the Oregon Trail did so for a single reason: opportunity. They came from a variety of different backgrounds. In the West, success was possible for everyone, even though there was no guarantee of it. In the mid-1840s, early westbound emigrants found gold in California. Stories flooded into the East promising the El Dorado of the West, sparking a surge in emigration beginning in 1849, properly named the California Gold Rush. Both men and women were caught up in the excitement. Lucina Wilson, a woman who traveled the Oregon Trail with her husband and 2 children, wrote, "The gold excitement spread like wildfire, even out to our log cabin in the prairie, and as we had almost nothing to lose, and we might gain a fortune, we early caught the fever." Others caught the Oregon fever for other reasons too. Apart from the gold rush, there was continuous promise of a better life and land. In 1850, the U.S. Congress passed the Oregon Donation Land Act to encourage more migrants to move west. Under the act, every individual would be granted 320 acres of free land. It was such an incentive to travel that some people made the trip, got their land, then moved back east. In his book The Oregon Trail, Sketches of Prairie and Rocky Mountain Life, historian and writer Francis Parkman accounted his hunting trip across the first part of the Oregon Trail. He met many different people at the journey's beginning. The migrants ranged from persons of wealth and standing to some of the vilest outcasts in the country. Most notably, however, were 3 old fellows zealously discussing the doctrine of regeneration. Everyone had a new chance of life outside the East's long-established social structures where some could potentially atone for the troubles in life they had and caused. Many people believed that the outcomes were well worth the risk of the journey, regardless of the specific reasons. Parkman wrote, "I have often perplexed myself to divine the various motives that give impulse to this strange migration. But whatever they may be, whether an insane hope of a better condition in life, a desire to shake off the restraints of law and society, or mere restlessness, certain it is that multitudes bitterly repent the journey, and after they have reached the land of promise, are happy enough to escape from it." Parkman wrote that he was unable to determine the various reasons that led people could only pack what they needed and had to leave the rest. To travel lightly and efficiently on the Oregon Trail, most migrants had to let go of many of the possessions they owned and leave with only the necessities. Many accounts reveal that people left the homes they built, the land and businesses they owned, and the luxuries they possessed. They appended their lives, put what they needed in a 14-foot-long by 4-foot-wide prairie schooner wagon, hoping they would be the lucky few who would make a fortune. According to Harriet Scott Palmer's memoirs, the spring of 1852 ushered in so many preparations, red work of all kinds. I remember relations coming to help sew, of tearful partings, little gifts of remembrances exchanged, the sale of the farm, the buying and breaking in of unruly oxen, the loud voices of the men, and the general confusion. Palmer was only 11 years old when she and her family left their Illinois home and their dog. "We looked back and saw our dog. His name was Watch, howling on the distant shore of the Illinois River. He never ate afterwards and soon died. From the beginning, it wasn't always clear which things to take and which to leave." Lucina Wilson wrote in her account, "It was a strange but comprehensive load that we stowed away in our prairie schooner, and some things that I thought were necessities when we started became burdensome luxuries. Before many days, I dropped by the roadside a good number of unnecessary pots and kettles, for one can wring only a few changes on bacon and flour, and it requires only a few vessels to cook them. Food was plentiful if migrants packed and portioned properly. Many families and migrants brought a stock of non-perishables and preserved foods. An emigrant from Missouri headed to San Jose, California, Newton G. Finley wrote, "Our supply of food was bountiful and of the best grade, also of great variety, consisting in part of cornmeal, flour, buckwheat flour, ham, bacon, sausages, dried beef, beans, peas, potatoes, rice, coffee, tea, sugar, honey syrup, milk, butter, dried fruits, apples green, walnuts, hickory nuts, hazelnuts, etc. Others, however, were capable of having foods unavailable to most." Luzina Wilson wrote, "One luxury we ha which other emigrants nearly always lacked, fresh milk. From our gentle muley cow I never parted." Some of the emigrants used their own hunting skills. Sarah Bird, who was only a young child when she made the trip across the Oregon Trail with her family, recounted in an oral history interview, "I see and remember it all easy plain easy day. Seein' them buffalo tear by, with their tails up and their heads close to the ground. There must be been 100 or more. That's a long way from 1,000,000, but the ground just shook as they went by. Some of the men got some good shots, and we had plenty o' buffalo meat for a while. Meat was roasted by putting a big piece o' tin in front of the fire. It was a sort of reflector. The meat was put between it and the fire, and you never tasted anything better than meat roasted that way. If any of those supplies ran out, however, there were trading posts where emigrants could get more food, or even trade their food for luxuries that were unavailable to them or their party." In his diaries, which covered his entire journey from Ottawa, Illinois to California, Alonzo Delano was excited by the change of menu available to him when he reached Fort Laramie, a trading post in Wyoming. "I received a pie and cheese when I joined them. Gods," he wrote. "Pie, veritable dried apple pie, which Charlie Lewis made with his own hands." And although his own mother might have turned up her nose at it, two youths who had literally fed on the salt of the pork barrel for weeks, with pilot bread for a dessert, it was a perfect luxury. Food wasn't readily available for everyone, however, especially since not everyone packed well nor prepared and portioned their food for a 2,000-mile journey. Peter H. Burnett traveled from Missouri to Oregon, but he was part of a group who struggled to adapt to their new lifestyle. "Our emigrants of the first portion of the trip were about as wasteful of their provisions as if they had been at home," he wrote. "When portions of bread were left over, they were thrown away, and when anyone came to their tents, he was invited to eat. Diseases that are highly infectious spread quickly. On July 24 my father died," wrote J. Henry Brown in his autobiography. He had nearly recovered from the fever he got from getting wet in the Platte, but he got cold again and couldn't get better. Neither our train nor any train that was available had a physician. We were compelled to travel, and having no spring wagon along, the roughness of the road, with the heat of the weather greatly aggravated the disease, and its progress was rapid. He died about midnight and was buried at sunrise in the morning. Disease was the top danger along the Oregon Trail. 6 to 10% of the approximately 350,000 people who traveled west died from disease. The prevalent form of illness was cholera, resulting from stagnant and polluted water. The disease was virulent and there was no cure. It would quickly attack a person's intestinal linings, cause diarrhea and vomiting, and usually kill the victim within the day they showed their first symptoms. The disease, however, was not unique to the trail. There was a global cholera epidemic, and no one, not even those on the trail, was aware that better sanitation could stop major outbreaks. Dysentery was another common disease, also caused by poultry and unsanitary conditions. Unlike cholera, however, there was a cure, and catching it wasn't a certain death. A person could have survived if they were treated with castor oil. Other diseases also plagued the trail, including measles, mountain fever, scurvy, smallpox, food poisoning, and pneumonia. But they were not nearly as problematic or deadly to the Oregon Trail migrant as cholera or dysentery. Migrants were at the whim of weather, natural hazards, and wild animals. Although the Oregon Trail was a strenuous route, It was one of the safest ways to travel west as long as migrants were aware of all possible natural dangers. The whole journey could take anywhere between 5 months to a year, crossing through the Great Plains, the Platte River, and the Rocky Mountains, each section having its own perils and dangers. To minimize the possible dangers, most expeditions and caravans left Independence, Missouri, at the end of winter, with the coming of the first blades of grass. Leaving at the beginning of spring made it less likely for travelers to experience terrible winter conditions, but it did present other problems. Anyone on the Oregon Trail was required to cross the northern Platte River in Wyoming. The river, at one of its most popular crossings, was 100 to 200 yards wide and 10 feet deep at its deepest point. Because of the time of year migrants were traveling, however, they would often reach the Platte River crossing in June, when spring runoff was at its peak. There were ferries that would take people across the river, but they charged for every wagon and every count of livestock. Many travelers couldn't afford the fee or felt they could cross without paying for the ferry. Though it worked sometimes, others weren't so lucky. Lucina Wilson and her party attempted to cross the river without a ferry, and though they took proper precautions, they couldn't escape the river's powerful current. Water poured into their wagon, sweeping away some of their provisions while their livestock drowned. She wrote, "The water rose over the moaning beasts, and they went out of sight inch by inch. Without a struggle they disappeared beneath the surface. In a little while the broad South Platte swept on its way, sunny, sparkling, placid, without a ripple to mark where a lonely man parted with all his fortune. Along the trail migrants would run into deer, elk, wolves, and bear, among other animals. Some of the most unexpectedly dangerous, however, were the American bison. Bison, which are sometimes misidentified as buffalo, move across the Great Plains in small groups, but they typically form larger herds in the spring and fall. Those herds could come towards migrant camps quickly and unexpectedly, leaving little time to get out of their way. Sarah Bird, though only a child when she and her family traveled the Oregon Trail, remembered the panic that arose at her camp when they saw bison in the distance. "It was dusk and we'd gone into camp when all at once, way off in the distance we see a big cloud o' dust," she said. "It come nearer and nearer and purty soon somebody yelled, 'It's buffalo, looks like a million of 'em and they're comin' this way.' Meb there wasn't a fuss then. Everybody was shoutin' to everybody else, and givin' orders and rushin' round like crazy people. Some of the men rode horses, and in one way or another, by shouting and using whatever they could, they prevented the buffalo from entering the camp. Though a million bison was an exaggeration, the ground still shook as the hundreds of bison were steered away. Wagon trains had to create constitutions to govern such large groups of diverse individuals. Independence was the common rendezvous for anyone planning to travel the Oregon Trail. According to Francis Parkman, a traveler of the Oregon Trail, the landing was some miles from the river in the extreme frontier of Missouri. Opportunity brought people from all over the United States and Europe to the shores of the Missouri River, where they waited for the first day of spring. According to Parkman's account, on the muddy shore stood some 30 or 40 dark, slavish-looking Spaniards, gazing stupidly out from beneath their broad hats. They belonged to one of the Santa Fe companies, and their wagons were packed together on the banks above. In the midst of these, crouching over a smoldering fire, was a group of Indians, belonging to a remote Mexican tribe. The boat was being observed by a few buckskin-clad, long-haired French mountain hunters, as well as 3 men seated on a nearby log with their rifles crossed over their knees. When people left Independence, they traveled in groups whose total population varied greatly. One of the first major wagon trains was led by missionaries Marcus and Narcissa Whitman in 1843, who led 1,000 settlers westward. The number greatly increased by the late 1840s when at least 50,000 people traveled on the Oregon Trail every year. In 1848, the Wanaw Company left Independence with approximately 20 wagons, which would have extended about a half-mile from the first wagon to the last. According to the diary of Riley Root, who traveled the Oregon Trail in 1850, it was safest to travel with anywhere between 10 to 25 wagons, though there were definitely cases that exceeded that number. J. Henry Brown's wagon train consisted of anywhere between 13 to 40 wagons, but they were a very picturesque sight, The white covers of the wagons and new tents resembled a small village, while the campfires shed their ruddy light on the surrounding darkness with its ever-changing hues and making the increasing darkness still more impenetrable. Each business had to decide how to organize the group. Some were loosely governed while others were set up with their own constitution or charter, or adhere to the rules set up by the leader or driver of the company. According to the personal journal of Captain Solomon Tehero, a wagon trainmaster in 1845, their constitution had listed articles to elect a president, secretary, and treasurer among other positions, as well as articles for the amount of cattle a person could bring, the fees each person must pay, and the resources they must bring. Emigrants feared Native Americans, but the fear was unwarranted. One of the greatest fears for many of the migrants were Native American peoples. There were a plethora of different Native American cultures along the trail, including the Sioux, Crow, Shoshone, and Ute, but most of the fear was fueled by stories generated amidst combat in multiple wars and skirmishes, which generalized violent interactions as the norm. When migrant Luzina Wilson first encountered Native Americans, she feared for her and her family's lives. She wrote, "I felt my children the most precious in the wide world, and I lived in an agony of dread that first night. I had read and heard whole volumes of their bloody deeds, the massacre of harmless white men, torturing helpless women, carrying away captive innocent babes. These stories, however, proved untrue for the majority of people traveling the Oregon Trail. The Indians were friendly, of course," Wilson continued, "and swapped ponies for whiskey and tobacco with the gathering bands of emigrants, but I, in the most tragicomic manner, sheltered my babies with my own body, and felt imaginary arrows pierce my flesh 100 times during the night." Her anxiety was unfounded. During his travels in 1843, Peter Hardeman Burnett came into multiple contact with Native Americans. He writes of a Cheyenne chief who he meets at Fort Laramie. The chief boasted that they had never shed the blood of the white man, and even faced by provocations and insults of a foolish, rash young man. He was a clear-headed man. Other Native Americans whom he wrote of kept at a distance, and never manifested any disposition to molest them in any way, while others further, like those at Salmon Falls on Snake River, traded with the emigrants. Even though some fights between emigrants and Native Americans did happen, they were rare and frequently proved to be more dangerous for Native Americans than for migrants. Between 1840 to 1860, Native Americans killed 362 emigrants, while emigrants killed 426 Native Americans. In addition, emigrants proved to be significantly more troublesome to Native American settlements than the other way around. Emigrants tended to overgraze the prairies, cut down woodlands they came across, and overhunted many of the animals necessary to sustain the livelihood of many Native American communities. Death was bound to happen, but there wasn't much anyone could do for those deceased. Though the statistics vary greatly, death was nonetheless a common occurrence on the Oregon Trail. From the estimated 200,000 to 500,000 people who traveled the trail, between 20,000 and 30,000 perished. Though the causes of death were numerous, the most were caused by disease, improper sanitation, and accidents. Along the trail, accidents took many different forms, including drowning, accidental shootings, and injuries caused by mishandling wagons or livestock. One of the most tragic deaths was recorded in multiple sources. Absalom Hardin and J. Henry Brown and I both went on the Oregon Trail in 1847, and they both tell the story of Richard Harvey, an 8-year-old boy, who tried to enter the wagon but lost his balance standing on the tongue. He fell below the wagon's wheel and killed him immediately. According to Brown, they consigned him to rest with a boot box for a coffin the same night, but kept traveling up the Platte River. Beyond the emotional toll that death commonly presents, burial of the deceased posed another problem for emigrants. Statistically speaking, there are 10 burials to every mile of the Oregon Trail. However, in practice, many had to be buried in their final resting place. Many cemeteries can still be found today. In 2015, archaeologists from the University of Wyoming excavated 3 skeletons of 2 women and an adolescent boy. They were found within view of a spring and a stand trees well known to be a resting spot along the trail, buried under earth and a large piece of wood. Life on the Oregon Trail was a paradoxical experience, simultaneously monotonous and perilous, filled with harsh realities and faint glimmers of hope, a journey defined by hardship but driven by ambition, faith, and the enduring belief in a better future. The Oregon Trail, which ran roughly 2,170 miles from Independence, Missouri to Oregon City, Oregon, in the Willamette Valley, tested the physical endurance, mental toughness, and spiritual convictions of tens of thousands of pioneers who braved the frontier for a chance at land, freedom, and rebirth. The fact that these pioneers had to work hard to earn every mile, that every meal was uncertain, and that every sunrise brought the quiet hope of survival is not nearly enough to adequately describe the challenges they faced. For most, the journey was not just about reaching a destination, but about the transformation that occurred along the way. Families frequently traveled in long wagon trains across the rugged plains, mountains, and river crossings in their canvas-covered prairie schooners because the trail was neither paved nor easily marked. These wagons, typically about 4 feet wide and 10 to 14 feet long, were pulled by teams of oxen or mules, and served as mobile homes, kitchens, and storage units for everything the family deemed essential, though the definition of essential quickly shifted once the grueling nature of the trail revealed itself. Migrants began their trek with hopeful hearts and overloaded wagons, but by the time they reached the Rockies, many possessions had been discarded to lighten the load. Iron stoves, wardrobes, books, and heirlooms often littered the trail behind them, silent testimonies to the weight of miscalculated expectations. In truth, life on the trail was relentless and exhausting. The daily routine was marked by early morning starts around 4 or 5 a.m., with men tending to livestock and wagon repairs, women cooking breakfast over open fires and packing up camp, and children helping with chores or simply trying to keep up. Most of the day was spent walking, not riding, next to the wagons, covering roughly 15 to 20 miles if conditions allowed. The monotony of walking under the blazing sun, the constant dust that clung to clothes and faces, and the discomfort of heat, wind, and rain became part of the daily rhythm. However, despite the monotony, danger remained constant. Accidents were frequent. People fell under wagon wheels.